Welcome to this webinar on public goods. My name is Aman Banerji. I am a program manager at the Roosevelt Institute. I am pleased to sort of welcome our key guest here today, Sabeel Rahman, who is a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and a professor at Brooklyn Law College. I usually love reading out very long bios of Sabeel, but I found that he grows more and more annoyed each time I do it. So this time I will, Sabeel. But I know a number of you are already familiar with his work. If you look at one of the handouts on this webinar, you'll find his most recent piece in the Boston Review around public goods. For all of you joining us today, we're here to talk a little bit about Roosevelt's public goods framework for 2017 and the ways in which you can build projects and campaigns on your own campus, in your own area, et cetera, et cetera. So let's jump right into it. So in building this framework, we had three key questions in mind. The first was, how do we tie together the work that Roosevelt does in multiple issue areas? As you all know, our sort of chapters are prolific in writing policy from education to energy environment to healthcare and far beyond. We wanted to find a little bit of a unifying lens. A second key question, of course, is how do we express the importance of policy work, or how do we adapt to what is, to say the least, a very different political context from what we lived in 6 months ago. And a third is thinking about the ways in which policy and organizing work together. I think one, maybe the only positive sort of switch in the last 6 months that we've seen is the ways in which folks on the policy end and folks on the organizing side have been brought together by some of what's been going on. That's a really important thing for us to be thinking about. That framework itself is public goods. So let's talk a little bit and begin at the point of what is a public good. From there, we're going to talk a little bit about who are public goods for, how do we provide for public goods is the third part of this webinar, and we're going to end on what can we do about it. How do we get involved with some of the movements, campaigns, build our own campaigns at the local level to be an active part of sort of this set of questions. As we're moving through the webinar, we'd love to take questions at any point. We will be watching the questions panel, so feel free to submit your question at any time. If your question is not immediately answered, we'll definitely look to loop back around and we'll end the webinar looking at some big questions. So let's jump right into it with what is a public good. And Sabeel, do you want to kick us off talking a little bit about how you see what are public goods?
Thanks to Aman and Roosevelt, and thanks to all of you for joining. I'm really glad to be a part of this conversation. So there are a couple different ways that we can think about public goods, and let me lay out a couple of key points. I mean, so first, there's a conventional economic story about public goods, or economic definition, which is that public goods are those goods which are non-rival and non-excludable. So goods where you can, one's consumption of the good doesn't affect the ability of someone else to consume that same good, and that it's sort of practically not possible to exclude one from consuming the good as well. So the classic example would be like the air we breathe. My ability to breathe the air doesn't affect in any way or can't exclude in any way your ability to breathe the same air. Then there's a more kind of production-oriented definition of public goods, which are public goods are those goods that have high sunk costs and increasing returns to scale such that they're likely to be underprovided by the market. So think like electricity or water, you know, it's really expensive to build the electric grid. Not everyone can do it. And so an ordinary market would underprovide the good. Now, the thing is, this way of thinking about it is A, economistic, but also B, focused really on the supply question of how do we generate enough supply. And so, you know, it can help justify some, greater government role in terms of providing a good, but it doesn't really speak to the larger moral, economic, social, racial dimensions. And so for that, I think, I've argued in the piece, and other people have sort of developed similar ideas, that we really need to think about public goods as a moral and political category. So the real question, I think, is not so much, just what goods need to be provided, because of sunk costs or returns to scale, but rather what goods are those goods that are critically important in terms of generating downstream effects, downstream capabilities for individuals. So, the goods without which we wouldn't really be able to participate fully in social and economic life. That's one dimension. The second dimension is that what are those goods where if we were to leave them in private hands, would subject us to the arbitrary will and domination of that private provider. So that's kind of abstract and theoretical. Let me give an example. So take something like water. So a classic, the classic economic case for water would be focusing on the sunk costs and returns to scale of the water system, right? So it's expensive to lay the pipes, but once you lay the pipes, now you generate a lot of economic potential. And so if the market underprovides a water system, you want government to make the difference in investment. But on this moral, social, what we're calling sort of small d democratic definition of public goods, the water story looks very different, right? Instead, the water story is, it's partly a social story, right? That, without water, we can't live full, meaningful lives as humans or as communities. But it's also partly a political story. So without some kind of democratic, public provision of the water system, if we leave the water system in private hands, that's dangerous, right? Because then private actors could exploit their control of the water system to extract greater rents, more profits, arbitrarily exclude some people from accessing water rather than others. They just have all sorts of unchecked power over this good that is so vital to the rest of us. And if you think about it, that's exactly what's at stake in cases like Flint or water debates more generally in Michigan, that it's not just about water as an economic good that's underprovided. It's really about the social and political dimensions of water. And that social and political way of thinking about public goods is, I think, a much more generally portable way of talking about all sorts of issues. So not just water, but healthcare, broadband access, a bunch of different things. And so let me pause there for on the definitional point.
Great. Yeah. Let me just go back a couple of paces. So one, from sort of Sabeel's initial description of it, I think you already see why we feel like this framework is so inherent to some of the things we experience and go through on a daily basis, from the water we drink, the schools we attend, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a big part of sort of thinking about and trying to build a policy framework that is important in this political context. And we feel like these are really serious questions to be asking. Sabeel mentioned a couple of examples. I just wanted to go through a few more. You mentioned water infrastructure, education. I think some of the smaller ones are also often equally important. 911 call service, weather forecasting, sidewalks, traffic lights, public libraries are all sort of great examples of public goods, which I think we often forget in this conversation. We often think about, infrastructure. But even those small little ones often go unrecognized, but play a vital, vital role. If we didn't have the ability to weather forecast, we would be in a very, very different position. Well, that's arguable, but we can come back to that. But that is sort of the broad framework, or that's some examples of public goods. So let's talk a little bit about the racial definition, or how public goods have come to be racialized in many ways. And I think currently when we talk about public goods, we do seem to have this language that paints communities of color as both the producers and the consumers of public goods. We seem to talk about communities of color as if they consume public goods way more largely. And Medicaid is a very good example of something that is used by a wide swath of the population, yet when we talk about it, the language that we use sort of portrays certain users as using those public goods more than others. So can you talk a little bit about this racial sort of dimension, and how did I think the white flight segregation story is a really good example of sort of seceding from the public in a certain way. So can you talk a little bit about how that evolved as well?
Yeah, great. So so first, let me back up for just 1 second. So we talked about defining and diagnosing public goods in the social and in a moral, social, political way, right? As those things that enable us to live full lives, and those goods that we don't want to leave in unaccountable hands, right? So one consequence of that is that the way we administer and govern public goods ends up being a critical site where we construct and produce inequality and exclusion. So if public goods are so critical to living a full life, being excluded from access to those goods or somehow being exploited in your access to those goods is a particularly bad, troubling form of exploitation or exclusion, right? Precisely because the goods are so critical. So if that's the case, then looking at public goods is actually a way to look at how our society actively constructs different types of inequalities and exclusion. So that's a kind of general conceptual diagnostic point. So with that in mind, then I think that helps explain a lot of how both economic and racial exclusion is constructed in our political economy today. So a good example is thinking about public schools. So education, certainly I think tracks with this broader social moral definition of public goods, right? Essential for living a full life as a member of society, but therefore the people who control access to education are particularly powerful. But if you look at the repercussions of racial desegregation of the school system after Brown v. Board, what you see is a whole series of municipalities essentially seceding from the larger urban metropolitan center as a way of restricting the access of who gets to participate in those public goods. So, if you're part of if you're a majority white suburb as part of a racially mixed city, the school systems are related and the school systems are now desegregated. But if you secede from the city and make your own municipality that is just the predominantly white suburb, now the schools are still technically desegregated, technically everybody can access, but it's limited to the borders of your municipal divisions, right, which no longer includes the more racially diverse inner city. This is a stylized story, but it's a lot of what happens with white flight and the secession from larger urban areas, urban metros in the 70s and 80s. And it's not just about schools. It's about schools, it's about parks, it's about public swimming pools. All these different public goods end up being the flashpoints for battles over desegregation and then subtle forms of resegregation. So that's one example of a sort of a de jure separation on racial grounds. I think examples like Flint are good examples of a more subtle but still exclusionary form of a racially exclusionary form of public goods administration. It's not that Flint had a different water system, or different water pipes from other parts of the state, but it's that the administration of Flint's water system in particular was treated very differently than other parts of Eastern Michigan. And so, if you look at literatures in environmental justice, for example, there's a lot of literature about how there are racially disparate impacts on the way in which different types of environmental laws are enforced and policed. And so this is another way of looking at the racially disparate impact of how public goods are actually governed in day-to-day life.
Absolutely, thank you, Sabeel. And we're going to come back in a little bit to the sort of the public school question and the sort of history of what the public choice economics movement, which I think touches on some of what Sabeel was just talking about from the context of education specifically and the birth of a series of ideas about how to administer the public good. So we'll come back to this. A few more quick points around sort of what is a public good before we switch tack slightly. I think Sabeel talked a fair bit about this in terms of sort of the social and moral dimensions to public goods. And I think the real question for all of us here is a lot of the time the conversation around public goods gets converted into this, is something a public good or is it not a public good? And when you think about public goods from this sort of, as Sabeel said, small d democratic point of view, that's not the key question. The key question is, how do we as sort of citizens of this community or citizens of this country think about what should be public goods? What do we want to make public goods? What are the types of things we want to ensure are available as shared public obligations for everyone else? Which means that I'm not just thinking about what are the public goods that I want, I'm also thinking about what are the types of public goods that I think everyone else should have a chance to consume fairly and equitably. that is sort of thinking a little bit in this democratic conception. And I think that sort of challenges us to ask the question of what public goods could be rather than what public goods are. And in terms of how that shapes out, I think it ends up sort of bridging this line between policymakers and organizers, where as organizers and advocates, we're looking to reaffirm our commitment to existing public goods. And of course, the healthcare debates and the ways in which sort of folks have stood on the front lines of this to defend the ACA is a really good example of defending existing public goods. But as thinkers and advocates, we're also trying to think about in this network, what could be the next public good? What should we be thinking about that currently exists in the private domain, or currently only a few people have the privilege of consuming, but that we want to ensure is sort of fairly and equitably accessible to everyone else. And Sabeel, I think one of the key examples of that is actually a conversation that's been developing around the use of Google and search engine optimization. Can you talk very quickly about how sort of some of that debate, how Google is being increasingly thought about as a potential public good of the future?
Yeah, great. So Google's a really good example of how, if we think about public goods in this social, democratic, moral, political context, the category of what is or isn't a public good is actually a fluid one, because there are goods that, 10 years ago may not have been so critical to membership and flourishing in our society, but now that's a different matter. So the internet in general is a good example of this. 15, 20 years ago, if you didn't have access to broadband internet, it's not that big a deal. It's a luxury good, not really central to larger membership in social and economic life. Now there's a lot of literature about that makes very clear the digital divide is actually a big part of how poor community, well, it's a couple of different communities, sort of there's kind of rural communities, and then also communities of color have underinvested access to the internet, which actually makes it much harder for them to access different types of, not just public sphere online, but also economic opportunities. Google and search is another similar example. So, when Google first started, depending on where if you weren't really on Google's search algorithm, or didn't score very well with someone searching Google, didn't really matter that much, right? But now Google has become essentially the gateway to accessing information and also economic goods. If you're searching, to buy something, right? It's the gateway for commerce and speech and flow of ideas on the internet. Now, that makes it essential, foundational, infrastructural, right, for all sorts of social and economic activity. But that means that now we're all at the mercy of how Google runs its search algorithm. And so, that doesn't necessarily, we haven't necessarily said anything critical about how Google runs a search algorithm. The point is that because it has centralized control over this new form of infrastructure, it now has the capacity to, if it wanted to, really have outsized influence, arbitrary influence on social and economic life. So it would be like the railroads in the 1800s. The railroads were privately controlled, and everyone was worried at the time that, well, if Cornelius Vanderbilt decides that, he cuts a deal with one business and really wants to serve, because he's getting a side payment, he's going to ship their goods faster than other people's goods, right? That's exactly the kind of thing that now people are worried about with Google. And so when a good becomes infrastructural or more like a public good, in a sense that it heightens the responsibilities that we expect of the people who are providing and running the good. And it also then therefore ought to raise our degree of criticism or vigilance, I should say, about whether those goods are being administered fairly.
Fantastic, and I think right there you touched on both dimensions of sort of Google in the positive realm of public goods. We want to think about the moral sort of dimension of ensuring everyone can access a search engine, and then there's the negative dimension of we want to check Google's power on being able to exert that kind of control over all of us. So I think that's a really good way for us to think about sort of how both of those things often work hand in hand, or actually always work hand in hand. So I think we've gone over a few definitional slides. I want to get a little bit of a sense and talk a little bit about this election season. And to do that, we're actually going to ask all of you first whether you think this was even something that, was this a topic that you heard about this election season? Was it something you felt like was in conversation? You are absolutely allowed to go either way. So we're going to give you about 30 seconds to think about that one. Okay, great. I'm going to pause it right there because we have a perfect split, a perfect 50-50 split. So the audience is perfectly divided on whether or not this was a topic of conversation this election season. So I think Sabeel, in my view, is a little biased, and I think we both think that it certainly was. Here, I'm going to just play a quick short clip that sort of deals with public goods a little bit this election season. Oh.
Save Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security without cuts. Have to do it. Get rid of the fraud, get rid of the waste and abuse, but save it. People have been paying in for years, and now many of these candidates want to cut it. You save it by making the United States, by making us rich again, by taking back all of the money that's being lost.
I'm going to pause it right there because I know that's not a great sound to have to listen to for too long. So that was one angle of how sort of one of the big candidates dealt with this issue. And then Hillary Clinton, of course, talked about higher education being a right, not a privilege for those who can afford it. So Sabeel, can you talk to us a little bit about what were some of the similarities, and more importantly, what was the biggest differences in terms of how both sides of the aisle thought about public goods this election season?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things about that. So first, I mean, I think the 50-50 split in the vote is interesting, and I think also revealing in its own right. You know, so while I do think that there is some discussion on both sides of public goods, like the Medicare, Social Security discussion, and then the higher ed discussion, I do think it's also indicative that, to the extent that it was discussed, it was as part of a larger laundry list of policy positions on either side. And I think part of the power of the public goods framework that you all are developing here, right, is that recognizing that it's the public good piece of the many, many things that both sides had to argue about that is particularly central and critical and politically salient. So this then gets to your second question about what's the difference between the two sides. You know, one thing that's notable, I think, is that Trump the candidate, though not Trump so far, Trump the president, Trump the candidate distinguished himself from the Republican field precisely by affirming his commitment to certain kinds of public goods, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. That's not how he's governed in the healthcare debate or the taxes debate, for example. But I think that's a big part of why he won the primary. Now, that said, Trump and sort of Trumpism in general is, I think, a good example of the inclusionary exclusionary dynamic around public goods. So one way to read the kind of Trump variation of the right is that there is at least some nominal commitment to public goods around, say, Social Security and kind of some basic aspects of the welfare state. But there's a very narrow notion of who is the we that is allowed to benefit from those public goods, right? So it's exactly the seceding from it's exactly the school suburb seceding from the city story. It's like, yeah, we're going to provide the public good. In fact, we want to embrace that. But on the other hand, we're going to only provide it to our people, right? As opposed to the whole public. And so that's a, you know, there are all sorts of obvious ways that we can critique that view, but I think the thing to recognize, that is a coherent and powerful view that has a deep legacy and history in American politics. Now, part of the argument that was not fully developed, but was certainly latent in on the left in the 16 campaign was sort of a different configuration, right? A commitment to public goods, an attempt to expand them, say around higher ed, but also alongside sort of a fixed notion that we want a broad definition of we the people who benefit from those public goods, right? Now, I don't think this was fully articulated really on either side, but when we look at the 16 election through the lens of public goods, I think this, these kind of come into focus more.
Absolutely. That's great. So, I mean, that brings us to the question of sort of who are public goods for. So we'll talk a little bit about sort of the ways in which it has been a long facet of American politics, this idea that we should police the borders of public goods. We've seen it from both Republicans and Democrats. I mean, Clinton and the sort of 95 crime bill and sort of work requirements that were imposed on welfare was a very big example of the ways in which he believed in public goods, but he felt like we must ensure that only some people are eligible. Only people that do thing X or have identity X are eligible for public goods. And in Clinton's case, that meant work requirements. In Trump's case, I think one big sort of difference that Sabeel laid out already is the ways in which he used this as an electoral strategy, recognizing that the Republican narrative on this was not something that was winning them votes. Not a lot of sort of Republicans, I think, were winning on this Paul Ryan narrative of we need to cut all public goods and gut all entitlements. So he recognized the problem is not we need to gut all entitlements, but that we need to gut the users of entitlements so that only some people have them and not others. And in that sense, he was really preying on sort of barriers of class, race. Citizenship is obviously a huge one. And I'm just going to play.
Don't treat us fairly. That's why I believe the time has come for new immigration rules, which say that those seeking admission into our country must be able to support themselves financially and should not use welfare for a period of at least 5 years.
So often folks sort of interpreted or looked at the ways in which Trump's sort of rhetoric around Social Security and Medicare and public institutions versus Trump's sort of very racist rhetoric as two different things. But that's a clear example of the strong way in which they were tied. He wanted to police the borders of public goods, but wanted to do it in a way that was very, very strictly based on your race, your religion, your gender identity, your sort of class base. So there was a real sort of desire to use those kinds of characteristics as the basis for deciding who is and isn't eligible for public goods. So at Roosevelt, we don't subscribe to that vision. Sabeel talked about the exclusionary versus inclusionary approach. I don't think it will surprise many of you that we believe in the inclusionary vision of public goods. We believe in a vision of public goods that actually challenges hierarchies of race, gender, class, and citizenship, so that we're actually advocating for, as we've talked about, a small d democratic version of public goods where we all have access. We all have equitable access to public goods, and it's not based on our race, it's not based on our religion, it's not based on our gender identity, it's just based on our personhood. That's the type of sort of positive vision that we hope to use here to counter some of sort of the strong latent energy pushing in the very, very opposite direction here. So it does bring us back to this question, though, of if and sort of the Trump narrative clearly identified that a lot of folks were very frustrated with the way in which public goods existed in this country. They felt like they weren't able to access the public goods that they depended on. But it had a very specific definition of why that was. And we've talked about why, or sort of it saw that issue as immigrants using your public goods, and that's why you weren't able to access public goods. But in this framework, in our more positive framework, what do we cite as some of the reasons behind the decline of public goods? And that brings us to this next question around how do we actually provide for public goods? So what are the various mechanisms that we have for providing public goods? And this is very important because we've talked about, or this piece becomes especially important when thinking about the negative domination capacity of public goods that Sabeel has talked a fair bit about already on this webinar. In terms of the provision of public goods gives a certain power to the provider, and we must ensure that we have some kind of balance or check on that power. We must protect against a few folks owning the type of power, owning the type of resources that all of us in society collectively need. This is the Google question, sort of writ large for public goods as a whole. But let's go back to a little bit of this question around how do we provide public goods? And both public and private mechanisms exist. And Sabeel, can you talk a little bit about sort of what are the two spectrums for providing a public good, and sort of where does the middle line sort of lie?
Yeah, so we've been talking about public goods so far, using the public piece of the term kind of loosely. I think one difference is that when we're calling a good a public good, what makes it public is in the sense that we want to ensure that everyone has access to it, and that's something that we assure through some combination of policies. It doesn't necessarily have to be that it's nationalized, provided by the state, though we could go that route. And so really, like, this is distinguishing the question of which are those goods that are so important that they have public import, that every member of the public should have access to them. That's what we've been talking about so far. Now we're shifting to the second question of, once we've decided that a certain good is a public good, how do we actually provide it? And so here we can think of a spectrum of strategies that basically sort of runs from some combination of some forms of private provision to other forms of pure state, or I should say market provision, to other forms of pure state provision. And so really we can think of it as a couple of different, a menu of options. So we could have the goods provided sort of purely and exclusively by the state. So that might be something like common defense or national security, something like that, right? Then next step over is there might be a public option. So there's a version that's provided by the state, but it competes alongside other private versions. So this would be like the public option in healthcare. But if you think about it, that you see this in lots of dimensions. So if we have public schools, that doesn't mean we have no private schools at all necessarily, though we could debate whether we want that. But public option is another alternative mechanism. A third alternative is what we might think of as public utility regulation. That's a little bit of a little bit jargony, but it draws on a history where once you have private providers of critical infrastructural goods, one option is to leave them in private hands, but you very tightly regulate those private providers and subject them to much more stringent legal obligations. So an example would be the net neutrality fight. ISPs, like internet service providers like Verizon and Comcast, part of what was at stake in that fight was, well, if we all need access to the internet for the economy to work, you can't have these private actors, overcharging fees and then also putting their thumb on the scale to, let Netflix pass its data faster than, a competitor that didn't pay off Comcast, right? But the solution that the FCC came up with wasn't to nationalize Verizon and Comcast. It was to impose common carriage obligations that required Comcast and Verizon and other ISPs, prevented them or prohibited them from engaging in this kind of putting their thumb on the scale behavior. So that's a regulatory fix, imposing higher obligations on the regulators. And then the last sort of kind of moving down the spectrum towards more and more market provision, the last variation here might be some kind of competitive market where if you think that it may not suit in every circumstance, but maybe it's a theoretical option that instead of having concentrated private provision, you break up the concentrated monopolies, and then you have a competitive market that where you have lots of smaller private providers, and because they're all competing, they're checking one another, through ordinary market competition. Now, in this spectrum of strategies, a lot of times you'll notice that some of the deregulatory strategies assume that we can use the market provision mode, but actually end up somewhere in the middle, and you get the worst of both worlds. So government says, well, we're gonna privatize the water system. It's going to be more efficient. Market competition will allow it to be provided fairly and cheaply. But it turns out that it's not a competitive market at all. there are only one or two providers, and then what you're left with is a private monopoly without any of the public oversight, right? And so then you have a choice: either you break up the private monopoly so that it's a truly competitive market, or you load up more public oversight, or you nationalize the thing and provide some kind of public option, right? So these are all different styles, and at different points you'll see some political actors, running with one rather than another, and you kind of have to ask yourself, okay, does this strategy work in this context?
Fantastic. And let's start on the far end of that spectrum. And one theory that's been advanced on that far end of sort of markets and sort of market competition will itself regulate is this idea and this theory around the best way to provide public goods is entirely through the market, the public choice economics idea. The public choice economics idea is focused on this question of sort of institutional capture. Government will always be captured or be taken over by certain interest groups that push it in a particular direction, and because of that, government, unless it sort of has 100% majority, will never be able to work towards the benefit of all of us. That will be impossible. So there will be no way that government has the capacity to work in this direction. It's very important here to notice that when this theory says that government will be used to push the ends of certain interest groups, a lot of the time the interest groups it's talking about are social movements. The civil rights movement can very well be thought about, and was actually thought about by the first set of folks that put forward this theory. James Buchanan and his sort of small clique around him was very much thinking about civil rights movement as one example of an interest group that was pushing government in a certain direction that it shouldn't be going. And that institutional capture piece was put forward, or this idea was put forward at the same time as new ideas around the free market being the best way to function in the economy at large were being put forward by groups like the Mount Pelerin Society and Friedman Hayek. It was also a time, of course, where there was very heavy it was right in the heyday of the civil rights era. And one of the first uses of this school of thought was actually, or one of the first times this school of thought was put towards political ends, was to think about how this question of public choice economics may be used or may be deployed in this question about public schools in the Virginia state school system, which very, very strongly opposed the desegregation of public education. So, Sabeel, that's a little bit about the view itself. Where do you think the public choice economics view sort of fails or breaks down?
So, a couple of things. So first, just a quick addition to your point, which is this idea of presenting egalitarian social movements as a mere interest group, and then framing their policy victories as examples of governmental capture rather than progress, actually goes even further back. So what Aman was saying about sort of the Buchanan take on the civil rights movement is actually the same story that, for example, in the late 19th century, business interests and sort of laissez-faire economics views, that's how they viewed the labor movement. So they saw the expansion of minimum wage laws and wage protections in the early 1900s, for example, as evidence of capture of government rather than as something sort of that was a positive change, right? So it actually has an even longer legacy, even going before kind of modern kind of Chicago school or Virginia school economic thought. In terms of where it fails, so I think the important thing to note here is that it's not the case that any appeal to capture theory is sort of automatically racially loaded or economically loaded against labor. I don't think that's the right takeaway from this. Capture theory on its own is a pretty simple concept that concentrated political interest groups can capture, take control of governmental bodies and pursue their policy preferences, perhaps to have outsized influence. So fair enough. I think the problem is more that when this idea of capture is used to only look at one side of, only look at one type of actor rather than the larger landscape. So, you know, why, if we're talking about capture, then we really want to look at, like, well, okay, who's actually doing the capturing, right? Is it, you know, the civil rights movement in the 60s, or is it the kind of the attempt to resegregate by resisting school desegregation on the part of particular, you know, groups in response, right? Or if we're talking about sort of the contemporary era, you know, who's more likely to be driving a real honest to God situation of capture? Is it, you know, labor and the fight for 15, or is it the financial sector resisting, you know, financial regulation, right? So it's the bundling of capture theory as a way to delegitimize all government or all social movements that's the particularly toxic problem.
Absolutely. And I'd just add to that, there's also the question of, I mean, so in the public choice economics theory, capture is inevitable, so government shouldn't provide any services or any public goods at all. But there's another way of looking at it, which is framing the problem slightly differently, or which is sort of how can we prevent institutional capture, or what are the ways to structure our government institutions, to structure our public goods, to ensure that that doesn't happen. And that, I think, is the really, really key question here, is if we're thinking about the two sides of the equation, one side being sort of the extreme private sort of market, and one side being sort of the nationalized public version, how do we ensure that both of those, government and private enterprise, are both balanced together in ways that ensure that that sort of the recipients or the consumers of public goods are not liable for subjugation by either side, are not dominated by either side? Essentially, what we're saying is then, irrespective of whether we're providing goods through the national public sector, through the public option, entirely through markets, the key question is, how do we continue to retain control over those goods that we are so dependent on to thrive? At Roosevelt, we believe, though, that public institutions do have a role to play, because if you're thinking about this question of balance, then the idea of just going in one direction, of course, has a series of problems baked into it. So we do think here that public institutions do have some role to play in providing that type of equitable, transparent, accessible public goods. We think that view is what brought a lot of folks to our network, is this idea that government has a positive capacity. It can be good. And a large part of why we believe the public sector has a role is because of that democratic accountability of the public sector. We do have an ability, however limited, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the problems that have plagued the public sector, but there do still exist forms of democratic processes, democratic checks and balances that allow us to exert some kind of control over public goods when there is an actual public sector component to them. So, coming back to this question around if this is the case and public institutions should play some kind of role, why is it the case today that we're in sort of the heyday of privatization in terms of the regular privatizing of so many of our public goods? And Sabeel, I'd love to ask you to talk a little bit about, or present a quick introduction around some of these three key processes that we've cited as behind the sort of decline of public institutions. We believe that the decline of public institutions is very causative of eventual privatizations. We think there's a very, very strong link there, but we find these three processes central to that decline. So Sabeel, could you give us a little bit of an introduction to all three of these processes?
Yeah, great. So, you know, if we think about sort of diagnosing the problem, right, of why our provision of public goods is so weak, and so central to inequality and exclusion, right? There's an important sort of diagnosis to be told here about how that came about. We can think of these three different mechanisms as sort of feeding one another. So on the one hand, you know, if you have, you know, we're living in an era where for many years public budgets have been slashed, right? This is true at the federal level, this is true at the state and local level especially. And as the just basic budgets for public institutions declines, that forces some greater cuts on the provision of public goods themselves. It also forces a search for other types of revenue streams or other kind of private operators who can provide the good more efficiently and maybe even generate a return that could help with the budget crisis. And so that then helps feed the rise of financialization. So a growing number of states and cities essentially spinning off their core public functions, like the water utility or what have you, to private equity firms, and then those firms, claiming that they'll run it, provide some, side payment to the government, which will help their budget bottom line. And meanwhile, the financial firm, private equity firm, will run the utility more efficiently. So now you've got from public disinvestment to financialization. All of this then kind of magnifies a problem of decline of accountability, because as you move further and further away from direct public provision, it now becomes murkier and murkier who is actually providing the good, and what are the pressure points or the principles or incentives that they're responding to, right? The private equity firm running the water utility, their incentive is to generate a return, which is not necessarily the same thing as an incentive to actually provide the good itself to the people who need it. And so now you've moved to a problem of public accountability and transparency. Now, so when we loosely talk about privatization, privatization is really sort of an umbrella term, a catch-all for all of these things that are happening at the same time.
Fantastic. And we have a series of slides. I'm going to actually just go over a little bit quickly the element of privatization here, because I want to get to a little bit around sort of what can you do and how can you build campaigns on sort of your college campuses. So just as a quick introduction to this section around privatization, when we talk about privatization, we're talking about the process through which public goods are transferred to the private sector. Usually the logic that's used is that the private sector will be able to provide these goods more efficiently. Another way that's often framed is less red tape, less bureaucracy, more sort of organizationally efficient are all sort of part of that language. And the second idea is that the private sector will be able to reduce costs for the taxpayer. There is a series of questions, particularly around the ways in which private firms have sort of cut labor as a means for reducing costs. But every time we hear that argument, I think it's worth asking, what does it mean to reduce costs when providing a public good? Who are those costs being reduced on? Is sort of a key question that we have to think about. This privatization phenomenon is very, very widespread at this moment, with the sort of ICE immigration beds, 62% are operated by private contractors. There's 2.5 million children in charter schools, 2.4 million students enrolled in for-profit education. Privatization is a very, very wide and popular theory at the moment. And today we don't have time to actually look at some of the factors that have led to this, but it's absolutely something that we would love to come back to. I think the key question here to think about is that government spends, and this is an estimate, about $7 trillion annually. And if you're a private firm that's interested in acquiring business, you would almost be remiss not to think about how do we participate in some of this government spending, because that could be a very, very important source of revenue for us. So I'm just going to move to some of the outcomes that we've seen of privatization. This was a report that was done by one of our partners on the costs of privatization. Some of the things that they accounted for across a series of privatizations in this country across multiple industries were, at large, privatization meant a higher level of fees, both new and existing, for consumers. It meant, and this goes back to the question around cost reduction, that in almost every case, for workers, there was a decreasing series of wages and benefits that went with what was once a public job. Together, both of those things, in terms of sort of lowered access to public goods and lowered ability to benefit in terms of the production, in terms of being employees in public enterprises, together, both of these things had a particularly strong effect on communities of color, and overall resulted in much higher levels of both socioeconomic and racial segregation. And a big part of why we feel like that, and Sabeel talked a little bit about this in the case of sort of private equity, is the goal for private firms is not to think about how do they ensure the equality or the equity of public goods. Their goal is to maximize profit. And that maximization of profits will often have these types of effects, and it is very seriously worth thinking about the ways in which privatization might play out of a good in your community along these lines? Does it have the capacity to increase costs for consumers? What will it do to the workers who were employed in these sort of formerly public enterprises? What could those two things combined mean for socioeconomic and racial segregation in your community? So let's jump right into what we can do about it. And this brings us right back to the point around sort of the ways in which privatization is enabled, or the ways in which public institutions have declined. And I'm going to mention a little bit about some of the projects as Roosevelt has already been working on in this area. On the anti-privatization front is one angle you can take if you believe in that the problem with public goods in your community is that they have been privatized in a particular manner, or you think there is the potential for privatization. This might be a campaign or a policy project that you want to begin. Here I want to shout out some of our folks at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, who've been fighting a privatization plan from the governor that's looking to privatize the management of all state level facilities. Could have a very, very serious impact on the workers on their campus, and they've joined a sort of large-scale coalition with their campus workers. And then we go back to how do we strengthen existing public institutions? So the first type of project you could do is think about positive pro-public institution projects. A couple of examples, we have a set of students at Columbia that are thinking about racial equity in admission to New York City high schools. We have a set of folks at Binghamton who are thinking about the ways in which sort of energy democracy might work, how we may be able to expand or use public institutions to improve the access and sort of efficiency of sort of solar. A second angle to think about in terms of improving public goods can be pro-public oversight. We have a set of students at the University of Michigan who are thinking about charter schools and the ways in which currently in Michigan they are highly underregulated and essentially function entirely free of any kind of regulation. And they're trying to build some protections to prevent against that. And then the final element that we look at is financialization. As many of you may have heard or may be aware, we have a big project called the financialization of higher education. What we're looking at here is the ways in which financialization has resulted in smaller budgets for some of our, or many of our sort of university institutions, but B, also meant that our university institutional priorities seems to have changed. So we seem to be focused on things like building big buildings rather than providing more scholarships or providing lower levels of student tuition. And again, here we have a number of folks working across the country on that project. If you're interested in being a part of that, we're hosting a webinar on the financialization of higher education in about 2 weeks, and would love to have you join us for that. So that is a little bit about some of the campaigns that we have. If you are a chapter or a student that's thinking about how to get started on your campus, here is sort of something to think about in terms of what makes a strong project. Ideally, we want something, or we think what is most successful is something that exists at the local level, something that is targeted at your city or municipal level, and in some cases your state level too, depending on the size of the chapter. We think very, very strongly that this is a real opportunity to actively join and engage in existing coalitions. We talked here about the capacity for public goods to unite the strands of policy work and organizing work. And this is a real opportunity. If you're thinking about a public good, one of the first questions you should be asking yourself is, who are the organizations that are already working on this? How can I be a part of some of that work? And we also think that as a chapter or a group, rather than writing individual proposals, it might be a good idea to work together either within one chapter or trying to connect with fellow folks at nearby chapters. In terms of how to get started on some of this, and before I get into these bullet points, you should know we have a full LOFT training on public goods on this Republic project that is available for all of you. The final section of that 5-part training is called Getting Started. It looks at sort of outlining some of the key steps. So one of the first steps obviously is identify a public good in your community that you have an interest in or that you feel like is under threat in some way. Research the ways in which it's being provided. Is it being done through the private sector? Is it being done through the public sector? What are some of the issues that folks have had, if they've had any? And then very, very importantly, find organizations or groups working in this arena. And here's where Roosevelt, in terms of our national staff, but more importantly, our national leadership team, I want to call out sort of the excellent work that our regional coordinators and policy coordinators are doing here. They have been thinking about what are the active groups, what are active movements going on in each area, so that if you say to them, hey, I'm in Pittsburgh and I really want to start a project on this sort of line, they can help you identify, here are some groups that are already doing that kind of work that you can either engage in the process or that you can join along the way. We think again here that coalition work is going to be the best way for us to achieve success, is going to be the best way for us to scale some of these wins. So please, very early on in the process, try to connect with some of those national leadership folks, try to think about how you might be able to work with other organizations beyond Roosevelt. And finally, we hope some of this might give rise to a 10 ideas written submission this year, where, as always, you sort of will hear a lot more about our 10 ideas, which we'll be launching in the next 2 weeks. And for folks that are interested, we'll also be hosting a webinar on that angle, talking about policy writing, what makes for good policy writing, how do you begin, what are the key steps, led by our policy coordinators. So if you're interested in, and we hope you are, taking some of these ideas and eventually building it into a 10 ideas project and building it into a coalition, we would love to work with you on every step along the way. So just before I look at sort of any questions that we may not have answered, I just want to recap some of the big follow-ups coming directly from today. So the first, like I mentioned, is please take a look through, while I hope Sabeel and I have been able to talk you through some of the key introductory training into what are public goods, we really think that you'd really benefit from going through our full training here. We will, of course, have a recording of this webinar itself, and we want to remind you to connect with your regional team folks. If you look on the handouts for today's webinar, you'll also find the slide deck that we used today called the Public Goods Framework Intro Training, and you'll find a longer training that's dedicated to privatization, if that's an angle that you're especially interested in, called Privatization Extended Training. Here too, if you're coming from a new chapter or if you're not fully confident with that content, we're more than happy to walk you through it or even conduct some of that training. So before we head out, I think we're just going to take about one question for you, Sabeel, and that's around, we had a question in the audience about how would a community build public goods, or how would you sort of start from scratch in building something like a transit system or permanent firefighters? What does that process look like? How has it been done in the past?
It's a great question. You know, it's obviously, these are, I mean, I think it indicates, right, it's an intuition, which is totally right, that these are really hard systems to build, which is exactly why, like, the privatization and deconstruction of them is so is such an insidious sort of threat to longer-term equality and inclusion. There are a couple of historical examples that we can point to that are useful here, I think. So one is that one mechanism or pathway has been where there's a good that has come into being and is being provided already through some set of private actors, but has become so critically important that it starts to become more and more regulated and then eventually converted into a public good or public utility. So, for example, the whole reason why we have municipal water and electric and transit utilities in the first place now is because of this transition that happened in the late 1800s. So initially, a lot of these services were provided by some weird mix of, you know, private companies, for-profit companies. You know, they were all competing with one another and then starting to consolidate and centralize. And there was a movement around the country to municipalize those private providers, and that's why you have water, electric, transit utilities in the first place. So, you know, the privatization of the water utility in Flint, that can only happen because 100 years ago, or 150, like 30 years ago, those water utilities were converted from private to public in the first place. So that's one route. Now, another route would be, you know, where there aren't very many providers to begin with, but it's something that we want to build. We think it's something that's critically important. That's a little bit harder in some ways. And there, I think some of the, you know, in the menu of options we talked about, that's where something like a public option starts to look really appealing, right? So it would be, you know, so suppose we were in a setting where there weren't any fire services at all. I don't think that's true really anywhere in the country, but just as an example, it would be a policy campaign to say, look, we want a fire service. It's something that's important for our community, and we want the government here to kind of fund and start a plain vanilla version of this service. And then around that, if other people get in the game, that's fine, but that's a way to sort of jumpstart this thing. And an example here might be something like the rise of universal pre-K in New York and in other cities. Obviously there are tons of private daycare providers, but we haven't really historically thought of that as part of the social contract, as one of the basic social services that government provides. But there's no single monopoly private provider that we would municipalize, right? So it's not like the water electric story. So instead, the strategy here that New York and other cities are taking is to create essentially a public option. They created a public version of universal pre-K daycare, but it's existing alongside other private providers. They didn't take over the whole space, but they entered into it by providing a universal, accessible, free version. And then the idea is that that'll grow and thicken over time, and at the very least, it'll force the private actors to step up their game, but it could also well become, something like, Medicare, right? So those are two different pathways, I think.
Fantastic. I think that sort of is actually a really, really good point for us to end on. For all of you that are still here 5 minutes on, thank you so much for staying on. Sabeel, thank you so much for giving up your evening. Sabeel sort of is quite clearly, as I'm sure you've seen through this webinar, a real leader in this field in terms of thinking about public goods, has written some incredibly powerful work and was very, very much at the center of helping us build this framework. If you're interested in reading his work, I've attached one of his pieces, Rahman, Public Goods. You'll find it attached as one of the handouts. Please download it, or you can find it directly on sort of the Boston Review website. But Sabeel, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure having you on and talking with you today. For folks that were able to join us, thank you so much. And like I said, we'll have a recording that we'll be sending out to everyone that's interested. We'll remind you of the links to be able to access some of this training, and we hope that you will start to build a project on your own campus. Thank you so much, and have a very good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck.